Hello, listeners, and welcome to the last episode of the Recharge Zone podcast for Season 2. I'm your host, Ann Margaret Gonzalez, and I'm joined by my co-host, Brent Doty.
Hi, listeners.
For our final episode of this season, and the last one for 2021, we wanted to look at how the Edwards Aquifer conditions are doing this year compared to previous years, in a segment we're calling The State of the Aquifer.
Joining us for this topic is Paul Bertetti, our Director for Aquifer Science. Paul, thanks for coming back for another episode of the RZ podcast.
Well, thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure.
So, Paul, we're talking today about the state of the aquifer. In other words, how do our water levels and spring flows compare to previous years? First off, can you remind our listeners what the Edwards Aquifer Index wells are and what spring flow measurements indicate?
Well, we use index wells to give us an idea of the status of how much water is in the aquifer. There's a couple of index wells. One is in Bexar County. You often hear it on the news. It's called J17, and that's a well located just on the edge of Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio. That, combined with the other well out in Uvalde that we call J27, are the two primary means that we use to evaluate the aquifer levels. They're used as a proxy for all of the water in the aquifer, even though they're only 2 points. We also use spring flow measurements to also gauge the aquifer's conditions and performance. And those are really important as well because you need an adequate amount of water discharging at the springs in order to maintain adequate health for the endangered species at the springs, but also to keep the other recreational activities and other industrial and municipal activities that are important, either downstream of the springs and into the springs themselves. So spring flow and the water levels measured by the index wells and the actual spring flow out of the springs are the ways we gauge and manage the aquifer throughout the year.
So these are important measurements that a lot of folks know about. They may see these water levels on the news. A lot of times the weather segment will have the aquifer level. There are even a few electronic billboards here in town that show that level. So a lot of folks here in San Antonio are used to seeing these numbers. And during our last board meeting, you gave a hydro update, which you give at the beginning of almost every board meeting, where you discussed the shortfall of the precipitation for November and December. And that, coupled with a relatively dry winter and early spring this year, meant that we're kind of behind, right?
A little bit. This year has been an interesting year. We started off with a rainfall deficit that we carried over from 2020. And through May, it was pretty dry, but we got a significant amount of rainfall in about the May timeframe and through the early summer. And in the end, if we added up all the rain that we had this year, we're actually greater than average. I think we have on the plus side, we're about 2.5 inches over, or maybe more, depending on how much it's rained today. And and so overall, if you looked at the total for the year, you'd say that we had more rainfall than average. The important part, though, is that the aquifer is a very, what I call a flashy system. The levels can move up or move down based on use and rainfall, and those can go up and down relatively rapidly. So if you don't get a typical amount of rainfall that you would have over a couple months period, aquifer levels can drop more so than you might expect. So December and January and that time frame is usually a good precipitation months for us in San Antonio. So we were a little bit behind as of last week, but we had a little rainfall earlier this week,
That's all right.
which was significant enough to raise levels and also give us some of that rainfall that we were missing. So now we're still about a half inch behind for December, but aquifer levels have come up a couple of feet already. And we're in much better shape than even we were, a week ago. And so that's one of the things, we always have to remember is that a little bit of rainfall at the right time really helps the system. Likewise, if we don't have rainfall over a period of time when we might expect it, it can be have a significant effect on the water that we use and put us into things like we call the critical management periods. And that's another thing we have to remember, that we do monitor those index wells very carefully, but they're tied to management levels and water restrictions that we impose based on the water levels.
Just curious, but do you know the average or the ballpark amount that J17 was at for the year, the highest it was for this year?
No, I don't. I'd have to look up
Okay.
that number. The historical average for all time, if you added up all the levels for all the time, it's about 665 feet.
Okay.
And about this time of year, we're about average usually. We're very close to the long-term average and very close to the average over time for this time of year. So, one of the things, I was listening to another presentation of aquifer levels at a meeting last week. And it really depends on the perspective of the presenter. I tend to be a little bit of a pessimist. So when levels are a little bit low and we haven't had rain, I'm a little bit more worried. Others might characterize it as, well, look, we're about average and everything looks okay, so we should be good going into next year. So it really depends, I think, on the individual's perspective sometimes, especially when we're just a few feet above or below average.
Yeah, I hear you.
Well, that's right. I mean, if you would have asked me where we're at without the benefit of seeing the data, I would say we had a really wet year. All summer felt like we lived in a tropical paradise here. Rained and it got over 100 degrees, maybe just a handful of times. And there was a lot of rain, but you have to remember, so we started off the year exceptionally dry and kind of had a dry November and up till now. So we're just now catching back up.
Yeah, I would say that things have been fairly stable the last half of the year, and that's been a good thing. Typically water levels in any one year, regardless of whether or not you have normal rainfall or less rainfall, they drop between 15 and 35 feet in any one year from where you start. So that's kind of a good rule of thumb. So you can say, well, if we started at 670, we probably would end up about 650, over the years, maybe a little bit less. So I would expect we start about average, then we should expect about average that we hit critical period management restrictions in the summer, like we usually do on average. So that's kind of what we should expect for next year, assuming that we get a normal amount of rainfall.
Yeah, that is one thing I wanted to talk about, was this concept of normal and average. I mean, we know here in Texas that our rain events are pretty flashy, as are our years. We have a lot of dry years and a lot of really wet years. So I was wondering, Paul, if you could talk about maybe a couple of our record years where we had record lows or record highs in aquifer levels.
Well, yeah, I guess so. I mean, the important years from our perspective were years in which we had significantly low amounts of rainfall and essentially were equivalent to drought periods. The early and mid 1950s in Texas was a significant drought period, and that's what we refer to here as the drought of record for our area. The lowest water levels recorded were in the late summer of 1956. And Comal Springs actually stopped flowing for a couple of months during that time. So that was a significant event, and actually initiated a lot of the water measurement and conservation features that we have now. I think we also had a pretty significant drought here in 2011 to 2014 or 15 or so. And that was pretty significant, not only for most of central Texas, but also impacted our area as well. And that was felt all the way through the system. So Uvalde, which has a little bit of a separate water pool than we do in San Antonio, they were significantly lower out there. So it was a pretty significant drought. And what we did learn, though, which was a good thing, that drought of about 2011 to 2014, the conservation measures that we have applied for the San Antonio area were very effective at maintaining spring flow. And so in a time frame when we might have expected that we had significant problems at the springs, the measures that we have employed actually worked very well. I don't offhand know the dates in which we had maximum water levels, but I know, depending on the rainfall and the years, those can get very high. I think the highest ever recorded was above 700 feet at J17. Those have always been interesting because the old, springs that don't flow usually, flow quite a bit at those times. And so it's quite dramatic. And that's always a good thing. I don't pay as much attention to the good times as I do the bad times.
But I feel like you always, scientists or like environmentalists, or you always are prepared for the worst, right?
Well, I guess we try to understand what the conditions might be if the worst case were to happen.
Right.
Because that's the thing that you really have to plan for.
Mm-hmm.
When I have students, often one of the questions is, well, can we get too much water in the aquifer? What happens if it fills up too much? And the answer is it really doesn't. Just more water comes out of the springs, and that's kind of a good thing. So we have to really worry about what happens when it gets too low, because that affects everyone. And that's kind of how we manage it, is to prevent the lows.
Yeah, I really can't imagine that drought in the 1950s. If you go to Comal Springs today and see it flowing, you really can't imagine that going dry for 6 months at a time.
Did Landa Park look that same way back in the 50s?
Yeah,
Like
I think the physical arrangement of Land O'Lake and the park was substantially the same in the 50s as it is now. There were some other features that existed that don't exist now. Likewise, a lot of those features were installed in the late 1800s, early 1900s, as there's some infrastructure put around the springs to essentially make the lake. The lake is a function of a couple of small downstream dams that keep the lake level about the same. So those lakes came about the time when some of the milling activities in the late 1800s, early 1900s in New Braunfels started. And so that was essentially generated the majority of the lake.
I see.
Even though it was always a swampy area historically because of the way the springs discharged.
Okay.
So a lot of the springs, that you see now, you see them running along kind of like almost like new little rivers coming out of the side of the rocks and flowing into the system. But what you don't see, and you do see a lot maybe at the San Marcos Springs, there's a significant amount of flow that essentially is bubbling up from the bottom of the lake. Mm-hmm. So all around essentially the central and northern part of Land O'Lake, there are hundreds of small discharges at the bottom. Mm-hmm. So that existed through time. Mm-hmm. So historically, those were all there. And so it was always a swampy, marshy area because that's the way the springs discharge for the most part.
I see. So speaking of these springs and how they can be affected by aquifer conditions, what types of phenomena affect our climate in South Central Texas?
Boy, quite a lot. San Antonio and the Edwards Aquifer system is right at this boundary of the Edwards Plateau and the Gulf Coastal Plain, and we're right about this 100th meridian in longitude. And, that's kind of a nexus of a lot of climate and ecological features. Yeah. Right? So same reason that people have a lot of allergies here in San Antonio is that you have all these systems that are contributing all this, this input, whether it's airflow that comes up across from the Pacific and Mexico to the typical fronts that we see coming in from the west to a lot of this Gulf Coast moisture. Mm-hmm. So all those things impact our overall climate. One of the things that's important, people hear like El Nino and La Nina and those kinds of events. And those also affect us here. So last year and this year, kind of in a La Nina cycle. Mm-hmm. So the Pacific Ocean system on the western side is a little bit, sets up a condition in which we typically have a milder, warmer, drier winter than we would normally. So that's kind of the conditions. And an El Nino type time frame, those conditions might be a little bit opposite. We might expect a little more rainfall in the wintertime.
So is that what we have at the beginning of 2020?
At the beginning of 2020, I guess I would say the winter of 2020 and early 2021, we were in La Nina. Okay. So that's part of what contributed to the conditions that enabled the big cold snap.
Right.
The milder winter is a little bit opposite of what you would expect for that cold snap that we had, but those kind of conditions were set up, as part of that system. They don't expect that the predictions so far indicate that we're unlikely to have a similar sort of set of conditions that come up, but we might expect a little bit drier than normal winter than we're used to.
Wow.
And it's kind of held true so far, and I think around the Christmas holiday it's supposed to be in the mid to upper 70s.
It is, yeah, I heard that.
Which is
I think my little phone app says 81 predicted for
81
Christmas Day this year. So
yeah, but it doesn't necessarily guarantee that it'll be mild the whole time, as we saw last year.
Yeah.
with that cold snap.
And that's another thing we have to remember is that we do have, climate change is occurring, and generally our temperatures are warming over time, and that's one of the things that's, we certainly see here in South and Southwest Texas. So we shouldn't be surprised that we have these kind of above average days, especially in the winters, as a result of climate change over time.
I'm glad you brought climate change up because we have computerized models here at the Edwards Aquifer Authority that we use to help us predict the future given a certain set of events. So, Paul, how do we incorporate climate change into those models, or are we working on that?
Well, yeah, I would say we're working on that. The models that we have are very good at reproducing what our expectations of water levels and spring flow might be based on a given set of recharge that might occur. Mm-hmm. The problem for us has always been how do we use the meteorological conditions or those parameters to get a good handle on what the amount of recharge will be. So one of the things we have to estimate is, well, what might the precipitation and temperatures be in a future climate scenario, and how do we represent that in the model? How do we calculate that directly? And that's a pretty difficult step for us, and it's one of the things we're working on now. So we're looking at a couple of different approaches. One is to use the computer artificial intelligence and machine learning models to directly calculate those relationships and try to understand what's happening. The problem sometimes with those is that's a little bit of a black box. We can't really understand the physics or the mechanisms and how that works. So we're using other kind of models in another way to say, well, we can correlate precipitation to stream flow, and that stream flow, which becomes recharge, we can understand how much that might be, and then use that to populate the model's recharge values and sort of predict how things might occur in the future. So one of the things we have to grapple with is not really calculating how much spring flow there would be for a given set of recharge, but are we going to have extended periods of droughts? Are the higher temperatures likely to cause more soil dry out and prevent the system from working as effectively as it does now? We don't know what those answers are. And so that's one of the things, our primary goal over the next couple of years is to try to figure some of those things out. We have a couple of really good scientists working on that now.
That's really interesting. It sounds like we could do a whole episode just on this.
Yeah, I think we should. So that's kind of where the EAA Field Research Park kind of research is taking off, right? Is kind of some of that soil profile, looking at that and seeing that how that data kind of can play a role in aquifer conditions to a certain extent.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I mentioned was, with increasing temperatures, sometimes you get more evapotranspiration, right? You have more water that's lost from the soil through plants and evaporation. And so we know that there's some soil management techniques that might help prevent that, to retain some of that soil moisture, which might enhance the ability for rainfall to recharge the aquifer.
Yeah.
So part of one of the big things in the Field Research Park is to understand what kind of land management techniques we might be able to apply that enhance that soil moisture over a long period of time. The other kinds of things are, well, does that increase the amount of carbon that we can hold within the soil, which might help with the total carbon budget of the system? Can it help improve water quality by eliminating some of the runoff and holding the water a little bit so it can infiltrate and then be filtered a little bit better? So those are all things we hope to find out. It's going to take us several years because these are activities that you can't shortcut. You have to make some pretty particular measurements and then observe them over time in order to learn what you need to know so that you can have the right kind of science to back up whatever process that you want to employ in the future.
That's so fascinating. I saw something the other day where it was talking about how, you rake your leaves and then you put your leaves and you put them out for them to collect. And so you're essentially like taking all of the nutrients and stuff out of your soil that would actually help your soil. And then you go to the store and you buy what they turned into soil and fertilizer for you to then put it back in your yard. And I was like, oh my gosh, if more people knew about like the health of the soil, right? How it just plays a role in like a lot of things.
Yeah, it's a big mix. One of the things that we're trying to learn is what kind of soil amendments, or what kind of so capturing runoff and preventing silting, or maybe enhancing the opportunity for plants to capture and then have some sort of build the organic profile of the soil. How might that affect things? We have a project going on now out there with University of Texas at San Antonio researchers to look at how the soil microbiology changes with changes in the soil horizon, because the microbes are a really, really important part of the development of that soil organic content over time. So, we're trying to do things from a variety of approaches to help us understand how the systems works.
That's so fascinating. Paul, thank you so much for joining us today and ending out the year with our final episode of the State of the Edwards Aquifer.
Well, I'm glad I could help, and really appreciate y'all's time.
Yes, thanks, Paul, and thanks to all of our listeners out there. And we hope to see you back on Season 3 of the Recharge Zone podcast.
We would like to thank you all for tuning into this season of the Recharge Zone podcast. And we hope you will join us for Season 3 as we explore various topics about the Edwards Aquifer and the Edwards Aquifer Authority. Have questions, ideas for topics, or things you would like to share with us? Well, reach out to us at rechargezone@edwardsaquifer.org.